Oh, howdy all, grab yourselves a beer, it is time for some Path of Exile discussion. Now today we got a list of all of the Cluster Jewel new notables and Keystones that are going to be added in the 3.10 Delirium patch. And there's a lot of them there. I highly recommend having a look through it. There's something like 300 of them, and what I've done is I've just picked out some of them that I thought were among the most interesting. So I picked out 20 of them, which can be broadly categorized into a few categories. There are defensive nodes, there are herald nodes, and then there's the things that don't fit either of those categories. So I'm going to pick out the ones that I was most excited by, but I just want to be clear that this is not a definitive list of all of the good ones. I'm not asserting for a second that the other 250,000 of them are all rubbish. In fact, plenty of them are probably really good. So let's go through them. Firstly, we have Lone Messenger. Now this is an interesting one. This is one of the Keystones. So on the passive tree, you have your Keystones, which are the larger nodes that have drawbacks, and then you have your notables, which are the medium-sized nodes that, generally speaking, do not have drawbacks, but provide more of a buff than a small node. And then, of course, you have your small nodes. So Lone Messenger is one of the Keystones, and it has a drawback as well. In fact, it's got a lot of drawbacks to it, but I think it's powerful enough to warrant considering anyway. So firstly, you can only have one Herald. Secondly, 50% more effect of Herald buffs on you. I'm going to come back to the topic of Herald buffs in a sec, explain what exactly that means, but that's a fairly significant but not a massive bonus. Now we've got the big line, and the reason that I pulled it out. 100% more damage with hits from Herald skills. So, this is something that is absolutely explosive in conjunction with Herald of Ice. And that's where I think the best use of Lone Messenger will come. It's not the only use for it, and I can certainly see a lot of uses for this in conjunction with Herald of Agony as well, or even Herald of Purity. But Herald of Ice is the thing that first initially excited me here. The reason for that is that you need to be doing enough damage to get real value out of Herald of Ice. You need to be doing enough damage that the hits that Herald of Ice inflicts on nearby enemies do enough damage in order to freeze them. Ideally, you want these freezes to also be one-shot kills, but you want them to be frozen. And Lone Messenger might well get you to that threshold. Additionally, 50% more damage over time with Herald skills. So this is for Herald of Ash, and I don't think you would want to use this usually with Herald of Ash. Minions from Herald skills deal 25% more damage. That is really strong in conjunction with either Herald of Agony or Herald of Purity. It is very important to say that the next line is going to prevent you from using two of the best ways of scaling those heralds. So that is Hatred, which is incredibly good at scaling Herald of Agony, and losing Hatred is a huge loss. It may or may not be worthwhile. We're just going to have to test that out with a bit of practice, with a bit of number theory crafting. Additionally, it also knocks out the ability to use Anger in conjunction with Herald of Purity, which I don't think is a commonly used option, but sometimes is. But more importantly than Anger, it also knocks out Pride, which is a very commonly used aura in conjunction with Herald of Purity. So there is a high opportunity cost to using Lone Messenger. One thing that strikes me with this skill is that the way that it's set up, it locks out a lot of the other ways you might consider reserving mana on a build. However, it doesn't lock out the new one. Spellslinger support is coming, and Spellslinger is a powerful new way to reserve mana on wand builds. Wand builds also tend to like Herald of Ice a lot. And so where I'm thinking you would go with Lone Messenger is that you would use it in conjunction with Herald of Ice, a quite juiced up Herald of Ice, that you would then be dealing double damage with hits from your Herald skills. So this would be a Herald of Ice that's linked to multiple supports. Then you're going to want to be using that in conjunction with some of the other Herald nodes that I'll get to later. But you're also going to be using Spellslinger support and causing your wand attacks to trigger spells. And that's going to be your second use of reserve mana. And the spell that I'm thinking you might want to use with that is Glacial Cascade. It's not the only choice, but it's the one that springs to mind first, as for a spell that deals cold damage. So that's something that we'll need to see the actual numbers, the hard numbers on Spellslinger support when those are revealed. But that's the first thought that I had with Lone Messenger. The second thought is that what if we were to keep a lot of mana unreserved and use the new Archmage support gem. So we'll use only one Herald, and we're not really going to juice it up that much. So we're going to have possibly 75% of our mana unreserved, possibly a little bit less than 75 if we do use some support gems. And then once we've done that, that then poses the question of which Herald do we want to use? And I think the answer is going to be Herald of Thunder. If we're using Archmage support, we're going to be doing a lot of lightning damage, added lightning damage to whatever our skills are, and then as a result, that is going to cause you to be more likely to inflict shocks on enemies. That's then in turn going to make your Herald of Thunder better. So, Lone Messenger, option 1, use it in conjunction with Archmage support and some sort of lightning skill. Option 2 is use it in conjunction with Spellslinger support and Herald of Ice. We're going to have to see how this works out once we have hard numbers on those gems. So, I mentioned this line, effective Herald buffs on you. I think it's important to understand what that means. So, Herald buff effect, this boosts the non-proc part of Heralds only. So, for example, with Herald of Agony, this increases your chance to inflict poisons. Herald of Agony grants a buff that gives your character 20% chance to poison, so that 20% jumps up to 30. And it also summons an Agony Crawler and deals with all the virulent stuff. That isn't affected by Lone Messenger at all, or by any other effect of increased or more effective Herald buffs on you. This is a pretty difficult stat to get in from other sources, but it's also not the strongest stat in the world. It's pretty good, but it's not amazing. For most Heralds, though, the reason you're using them is the proc. The exception, and I think it's the important one, is for builds that are using Facebreaker and that are then using Herald of Purity. Herald of Purity gains a lot from getting 50% more effective Herald buffs on you when all of the physical damage that you're dealing with your unarmed attacks is getting multiplied by as much as an 800% more multiplier. Okay, so that's lots of talking about the first of these new Keystones. There's another 19 to get through, so let's get a bit faster. Secondly, of interest was Kineticism. Now, I'm raising this one not because I think it's particularly great. I think it's got a very narrow niche, but I think for most players this is going to be actively bad. So attack projectiles cannot force, or well, actually all your projectiles cannot pierce, fork, or chain, but your attack projectiles always inflict bleeding, maim, and knockback. Now, normally, inflicting bleed and knockback and maim together, this is a very powerful effect to have on monsters, but it's also a really inconvenient one. If you're running content that is miles harder than your character can handle, this sort of effect is really strong. It lets you go slowly and surely through content, pretty safe in your ability to use Kineticism to deal with enemies for you. You know, push them away so they can't hurt you, slow their movement speed so they can't get back to you, and inflict bleeds so they bleed out when they try. That said, I don't recommend this outside very narrow cases. You definitely don't want it for general purpose mapping. It's powerful, but it will slow you down, and bosses are often immune to knockback. But it may be good in conjunction with Gladiator bleed explosions, and it may also be good in certain delve situations. I think this is niche but cool. I don't think it's particularly strong. And the next one I want to raise is Veteran's Awareness. So this is an extreme brief buff to resist when you most need it, but you're also more vulnerable once it falls off. And as well as resist, it also affects your physical damage reduction. I think it's very important to note that your non-Val guard buffs can be lost if you're using either Steel Skin or Molten Shell, just by virtue of you taking one massive hit. So the idea with Veteran's Awareness, in theory, or at least with the way it was originally designed, I think that the theory of the designers was, this is something that if you feel you've got the technical play skill to throw up a guard instantly just before a big hit comes in, then this is going to save your ass. And it will do that. But I don't think that's the best use for it. I think the best use for this is in conjunction with the one guard skill that doesn't go away, and that is Immortal Call. So what you will do is you'll connect cast when damage taken to Immortal Call, and you're going to want to extend the duration of it as much as realistically possible. And then, when you take a hit, Veteran's Awareness will kick in. You'll have a few seconds of godlike defenses while your guard skill lasts. Then, once it falls off, you've got 4 seconds while you are very, very, very vulnerable. And then after that, you get it back. You'll notice that this is set up so that it doesn't work in conjunction with Vile Molten Shell. That's because Vile Molten Shell is so incredibly powerful that if Veterans Awareness worked with it, it would make Vile Molten Shell even better. And the last thing in the world that Vile Molten Shell needs is to be any better than it already is. Lastly, if your Blade Vortex build has a lot of evasion and or dodge, then I highly recommend that you check this out and you use Cast While Damage Taken Immortal Call. When your Immortal Call procs, that is the warning to get the hell out and just to make sure that you can survive the 4 seconds after the Immortal Call runs out. And then at that point, you'll be back to full survivability again. So next up we have the Impale nodes that I want to go through. So first of those is Vicious Skewering. And what this does, I'm going to raise 3 of the Impale nodes and go through them quickly. But Vicious Skewering requires other sources of bleed. It's not good enough on its own. You need to be inflicting bleeds via various other means. However, it works in conjunction with Chance to Bleed support, which is a pretty good support gem for a lot of skills. So you might have Chance to Bleed incidentally anyway. The key here is not the 10% chance to impale enemies on hit. That's a very easy stat to get. It's the 15% increased effect of impales inflicted by hits that also inflict bleeding. Now this stat, if increased effect of impales, is extremely powerful. And basically you want to stack as much of it as you can. For that reason, this node is strong overall, just for that third line. You do need to have enough chance to bleed to make it worthwhile, but if you can get that without taking absolute shit nodes on the trade, then this is going to pay you off quite well. The bleeding's not necessarily something you're even going to try and scale. It's just something that will be there. Next up in related notables, we have Deep Cuts. 15% chance to impale enemies on hit with attacks. Don't worry about that. That's not the reason you're taking this. Impales you inflict last 1 additional hit. This is a huge mod. This is an absolutely huge mod. So basically it is like another axis of scaling impale. If your default is 5 impales, which it is for every class except champion, then this will be 20% more impale effect. If you're currently sitting at 7, then this is still 14% more impale effect. In both cases, it's a very meaningful damage multiplier on the passive tree. There's lots of ways to add to your damage on the passive tree. There's not many ways to multiply it, and Deep Cuts is one of those. We also have Run Through. Run Through also has increased impale effect. It has some other text on it as well, but all I really noticed is that it's got 10% increased impale effect. Yeah, everything else on this is just sort of neither here nor there. It is interesting that they're going out of their way to support a 1 axe and 1 sword sort of setup with some of these new nodes, and that might make the Rigwald's weapons a little bit better than they have been in the past. So the next one that popped to mind was Grimm Oath. Gain 10% of physical damage as extra chaos damage. This is a huge stat for physical poison builds. If they're good, then this notable will be part of the reason that they're good. If they're not good, it's not so strong that it will get them there, or that it will get it there on its own. I will say though that there has been some footage that was doing the rounds of a very, very well set up Power Siphon wand character that was doing physical damage and then using that physical damage to inflict poisons on enemies, and that's the sort of thing that Grimm Oath is going to be really good with. Next up, there's going to be a whole lot of discussion of heralds. So let's just jump down to not these herald skills. Purposeful Harbinger. This is a really interesting one. This can easily be 30% increased effective auras on you. Now, if you've got 3 heralds on yourself, 3 is about as many as you can get with, whilst making sure that every single herald is providing a useful benefit that justifies the mana you're reserving on it. You can get all 5, but getting 3 of them is doable on a normal build. You can conceivably get 4 on a Void Forge build or a Doomfletch Prism build, but that's getting a little bit more niche. For most people, 3 is going to be the limit. That'll be builds like Tri-Element Blade Vortex, and they can often make make good use out of 3 heralds. They'd be using the 3 heralds anyway. So 10% increased effective auras per herald affecting you is 30% increased effective auras on you. Now, this is not a small number if you have an aura support, or if you're often mapping with aura support characters. I think for that reason that this is a really strong node. Getting 30% increased effect of someone else's discipline on you is going to make a huge difference in your survivability. Likewise, someone else's grace, someone else's anger or wrath will add lots of damage. So all around, this is a really powerful effect. It's very difficult to use though without parties, because you just don't have infinite mana to reserve, and you generally speaking, if you're reserving lots of auras, you won't also be able to reserve lots of heralds usually. But I'm sure that there will be people that find a way to make this work. Next up we have Indubringer. And Indubringer is exactly the same mechanic, except it boosts a different stat. 25% increased damage for each herald affecting you. This is mandatory on every tri-herald build that has pretty much ever existed. Did I mention before that there's a tri-herald Blade Vortex build that's already pretty good? Just in case I didn't, there's a tri-herald Blade Vortex build that's pretty good. And this is going to really help it. 75% increased damage is a hell of a lot to get on one notable. And so it's going to make a real impact. Next up we have Lasting Impression. So here's an interesting one. This has 2 stats on it that run almost at counterposed purposes, even though it doesn't look like it. But they're so good that you might use them anyway. So Herald of Ash is what comes to mind here. Herald skills deal 50% increased damage over time. I'm quite happy to see Herald of Ash deal 50% increased damage over time if I'm using Herald of Ash to clean up stragglers when mapping. So if you're playing a build that mostly just does an initial hit, and to one massive hit to a crit monster, and then relies upon Herald of Ash to propagate that to kill other mobs, Lasting Impression could very well be a good friend. Last one that I want to call out, well, the second to last one I want to call out in the Herald section is Dark Messenger. The numbers on this aren't all that high. 25% increased area of effect and 20% increased damage. These are both okay, but they're nothing to write home about. However, they're just exactly what Herald of Ice needs in order to self-propagate effectively. So self-propagation, again, being the idea that the cold damage from one explosion triggers other monsters to explode. And while we're talking about Herald of Ice and self-propagation, let's talk Self-Fulfilling Prophecy, because this is one I've already ranted and raved about how excited I am by this. It's a really exciting mod. Herald base crit is very hard to get. So what this plus 1% to critical strike chance of Herald skills mean, and we're just going to say Herald of Ice because that's what this is for, this means that your Herald of Ice has a base crit of 0. All things like power charges or items that say plus X% chance for you to land critical hits, or passive nodes on the tree, generally speaking, they're multipliers on this 0. So you have 0%, then you've got 10 power charges, each of which give you 40% more, increased critical strike chance. So suddenly you've got 500% of 0. Isn't that just great? However, Self-Fulfilling Prophecy starts that at 1%. You're probably still going to need to find some other source of base crit, but this is a huge buff to any build that wants to have Herald of Ice crit a lot. And there's a few other sources of base crit. I also think that this is going to be really good on builds that are not assassins, in helping them get base crit. To say, there's other solutions. There's various essence-specific mods that add 3.5% base critical strike chance to socketed spells. There's the increased critical strikes gem. There's a lot of options, but this is one of the best ones because it comes in a place, the passive tree, where there's just not that many other options for increasing your chance to critically strike. I don't think that this does particularly much for other Herald skills. So let's talk quickly about very basic life nodes. And I picked out a few of them, but it's not like they're the only ones. Fettle, 20 life, 10% maximum life. There's a very similar, although slightly worse node on the passive tree called Constitution. It's at the heart of the Scion life wheel. It's one of the single best nodes on the entire passive tree. And Fettle is basically doing the same thing and stacks with Constitution. It's not quite as good as Constitution is, but it's good enough that you don't care. It's a good node. Sublime Sensation. 10% increased maximum energy shield, 8% increased maximum life. This is really, really, really good. It needs to be seen whether this can be affected by the jewels that transform energy shield into life or into various other resources. I don't know if that's the case or not, but I already think that even if it can't be, this is just really good. 8% increased maximum life is good enough that you would feel interested in that cluster, assuming that the cluster's small passives are of some value. And when you've got 10% maximum energy shield as well, this is just great on hybrid builds. Our last one I want to point out in the very basic life node section is Wall of Muscle. It just basically gives you strength and life all in one place. Strength already gives you more life. Each 2 points of strength that you get give you 1 point of base life. So if you're not stacking strength, this might take say a typical Marauder build from 360 strength up to 360 up to 378. That's only 9 base life, but it is still something meaningful. If you are stacking strength though, this might take you from 800 to 840 for 20 points of base life and 6% increased maximum life. Or if you're stacking strength in a really hardcore way, this might be the difference between sitting at 1500 and 1575, in which case it is a very significant life node. It's going to be one of the best ones on the tree. So yeah, this one's really good. Additionally, we have Holistic Health, which is mostly something I'm calling out for Mind Over Matter builds. It's good anyway, even if you're not a Mind Over Matter build. It's just such a high power node that you'll be interested in it anyway, but it's really good. Really, really, really good on builds that run Mind Over Matter, where both halves provide a large defensive bonus. So let's have a look at Enduring Composure. This is one of the most impressive of the new nodes, in my opinion. So the first line's nothing special, but it is useful. 30% increased armor. That's going to make your Molten Shell better if you use Molten Shell. But that's not the line that excites you about this. It's not the line that excites me about this. Gain an endurance charge every second if you've been hit recently. If your character is built tough enough to survive taking one hit to survive taking one critical hit from pretty much everything that you're fighting, then this is going to provide an absolutely massive boost to defenses. One thing that I noticed in the Synthesis League, I had a synthesized Val Regalia that had this mod on it, something that's a legacy item now. And that Regalia would be the difference. My character was a pure energy shield build. I think they had about 11,400 energy shield by the end of the league. If I were to take a single normal hit from the Shaper, and then later take a full slam from the Shaper, that's his big wind-up attack, the teleport slam that's designed to be a one-shot mechanic, kill your character pretty much no matter what you do. Once I had my 3 endurance charges up, that'd only ding me for about 9,000 energy shield. And so it was something that I could quite easily survive even without any flasks up. If I had I'm trying to remember the defensive flasks I had then, whether I was using Taste of Hate or not, but it's entirely possible I could have got that down to 7,000 or lower if I was using defensive flasks as well. And that's the sort of thing that means that you can survive the biggest hits in the game once you've got your endurance charges up. But normally in mapping, you're taking a lot of smaller hits, and this will potentially keep you at 3 or more endurance charges. If you've got a cap of more than 3, this will keep you at 3 endurance charges for most of your mapping experience. That is just a tremendous defensive layer, and in conjunction with the 30% increased armor making Molten Shell even better should you be using it, this is just an incredible node. I think that this is going to be such a good node that any champion build, or basically any melee build that isn't a Juggernaut, but basically champions and slayers are going to want to take this. It's so good, in fact, on a Slayer that I think it may make you want to consider taking Masterful Form, which is not a very popular node at the moment, but is one that has a lot of raw power. What it does, firstly, it increases your frenzy and endurance charge duration, but then it wipes out your maximum endurance charges, replaces that number with the number of frenzy charges you've got. So it means that basically every source of an additional frenzy charge you can add to your character also adds an additional endurance charge. So Masterful Form will be really, really powerful in conjunction with Enduring Exposure. The last ones I want to point out are just three of the simplest ones, but they are going to be very meaningful. So, Chaos Resistance. Chaos Resistance has become a lot better in the recent state of Path of Exile. Ever since the Betrayal League, every single new mechanic that's been added has been finding more and more ways to deal chaos damage to your character. So in Betrayal, it was not so much the bosses themselves. It That Fled and Tora do have some pretty nasty chaos damage hits, but generally speaking, characters with low chaos resistance could survive those. What it was that was absolutely ripping people apart was the Necromancers. So some of the trash mobs, they seem to have a purely chaos damage skill that wasn't enough to knock you from full life to dead in any short period of time, but in conjunction with all the other incidental damage you're taking, it meant that you were taking a lot of damage. So that was Betrayal. Then along came Synthesis, which was pretty light on the chaos damage, but then Legion was absolutely brutal with it, and then it only got nastier in Blight, and nastier again in Metamorph. I had so many early character deaths to Metamorphs dealing absurd amounts of chaos damage, and even towards the end of the league, it was still something I was scared of. So there are three new really good sources of chaos resistance. The first one I want to point out is Born of Chaos. Now this is a very niche, very, very, very niche node. You're only really going to use this in conjunction with builds that use Divine Flesh as a defensive layer as well. Let me just bring up Divine Flesh to demonstrate what that is, if you're not familiar with it. Divine Flesh can only be sourced by using the Glorious Vanity unique jewel, which is one of the timeless jewels. It's the Vaal themed one, and it will give you the following mods. So all damage taken bypasses energy shield. So basically, your energy shield becomes useless as a defensive layer, but 50% of elemental damage is taken as chaos damage, and you get 10% maximum chaos resistance. This means that if you can convert some of the damage you're suffering to physical damage away from physical into elemental and/or chaos damage, there's a few ways to do that. Then you can provide yourself with a tremendous defensive layer here. It's really good on life builds. So this allows you to get to 85% chaos resistance. You still actually need to find the chaos resistance gear to get you there, but that's easier than it used to be. And it's going to be able to be 88% in conjunction with Born of Chaos. And then all you need is Soul of Steel, PoE, and that will take you up to 89%. Oh, sorry, no, that's actually only elemental resistances. There's something else that has 1% to all resistances. I think it might be the Amulet Vaal Implicit. But so no, I was wrong on that. So that'll get you up to 88%, and then you're close enough to 90%. You can actually cap all 4 of your resistances at 90% if you go all in on trying to raise them. But because you're taking half of elemental damage as chaos damage, actually you can be quite fine with Born of Chaos and Divine Flesh, and just 75 for the elemental resistances. So I wanted to raise this one because it is a very niche node, but a very powerful niche node. Next up, there's Anti-Venom and Student of Decay. Now these are just really efficient nodes that give you a lot of chaos resistance. So Unaffected by Poison is really powerful. Poisons are one of those subtle little killers. A lot of people run the Soul of Shikari, I think it is, the one that you can upgrade through the Pantheon system to become immune to poison. So that's an alternative way of getting Unaffected by Poison, but this will get it to you on a node that's already pretty good. 17% chaos resistance is already a pretty good node on its own. Student of Decay is the other one I'm pointing out. 13% chaos resistance, but it's also on something that's dealing damage, that's increasing damage over time, which is one of the harder sources of damage to get a lot of. But of course, Blessed is really good too. I haven't called out Blessed in the 20 because I just wanted to keep it to 20, and I didn't think there was a need to list every single thing. So hopefully that gives you 20 of these to have a look for. But definitely have a look at the list yourself, because I can't cover everything. This has already gone for 30 minutes and I don't want it to be any longer. So have a look through this list. You'll find more that excite you, I'm sure of that. As far as how rare these are going to be in game, it's generally been said that the large and medium cluster jewels should be fairly accessible, and small ones will be quite a bit rarer. And so the small ones are the ones that focus on life, mana, and defenses. Life, energy shield, mana, and defenses. So those should be the rarer ones. Unfortunately, that's going to mean the chaos resistance ones as well, I think. But who knows? Like, if you're playing in a trade league, you'll be able to find them. It just might be that a small jewel that's good might be a few exalts, whereas a large or medium one might be available for a price that's closer to a tabula rasa. 20 chaos very early, 5 to 10 later. Anyways, leave it there. Feel free to leave comments and questions below.